to Sign Facts, where every movie hides a secret. Every scene tells a deeper story. And every frame contains details most viewers never notice, from legendary blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to dark thrillers, unforgettable horror, and hidden cinematic gems. We explore the facts, theories, Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that make movies truly unforgettable. This isn't just watching movies, this is discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Sign Facts and step beyond the screen. Nobody expects much from her at first, but that changes instantly. She completely destroys her opponent, using the vibrations in the ground to sense every movement around her. She doesn't need sight, because the earth itself tells her where everything is. Watching her fight, Aang suddenly remembers Bummy's words about a teacher who listens and waits. In that moment, he realizes this blind earthbender might be exactly who Bummy was talking about. She's not just strong, she understands earthbending in a way Aang has never seen before. Unfortunately, before Aang can speak to her properly, the blind bandit disappears after the tournament, leaving him with more questions than answers. Soon afterward, Team Avatar receives an invitation from the Beifong family, one of the richest and most powerful families in Jailing. They've supported several avatars in the past, so Aang and his friends accept the invitation and visit their estate. Once they arrive, they discover the shocking truth. The blind bandit is actually Toph Beifong, the family's daughter. Her parents see her as fragile, helpless, and in constant need of protection. They have no idea that their delicate daughter has secretly become one of the most impressive earthbenders in the region. Toph has built an entirely separate identity underground, where she's feared and respected as a champion fighter. During dinner, Aang almost exposes her secret without meaning to. Before he can say too much, Toph kicks him under the table, forcing him to stay quiet, while everyone else remains unaware. She uses earthbending to carve a message into the ground, telling Aang to meet her later that night and, more importantly, to stop talking about her fighting. Later, when Aang finally meets her in secret, Toph opens up and tells him the truth about her life. When she was only about 6 or 7 years old, she accidentally found her way to a cave filled with badger moles, the very first earthbenders. Because they were blind just like her, there was an instant, silent understanding between them. They experienced the world the same way, not through sight, but through movement, pressure, and vibration. By watching how they moved and copying their rhythm, Toph slowly taught herself earthbending in its purest form. The wild part is that her parents have absolutely no clue what she can really do. They believe she's helpless and fragile, so they hired an instructor with very strict orders. Teach her only the simplest basics, and never push her beyond that. In their minds, Toph needs protection from the world. In reality, she could probably handle most of the world by herself. Toph does want to help Aang. She knows she could teach him in a way no one else can, but she also tells him she can't just leave, because her parents control every part of her life. Meanwhile, fate brings Zuko to Jailing as well. While passing through the area, he sees a local boy getting bullied at a checkpoint, where soldiers are demanding half of his produce just to let him through. Zuko steps in and confronts them, helping the boy out of trouble. Grateful for what he did, the boy and his sister offer him shelter, and Zuko stays with them for a while. But the moment he hears that the Avatar is nearby, everything changes. Zuko immediately heads out to find Aang, only to be intercepted by Azula first. She tells him that their father has changed his mind, that Zuko's banishment has been lifted, and that she's been sent to bring him home. Zuko doesn't trust her for a second. The tension quickly turns into a fight, and right in the middle of it, Team Avatar arrives. Toph joins the clash too, showing just enough power to make Azula reconsider her position. Forced to retreat, Azula doesn't leave quietly before escaping. She attacks Aira, who had arrived to protect Zuko. Team Avatar offers to heal Aira using waterbending, but Zuko refuses their help completely. His pride won't allow him to accept kindness from the people he spent so long chasing. Honestly, Zuko's behavior is frustrating, because deep down he has never truly been like Azula. Even when they were children, the difference between them was obvious. Zuko clearly inherited more of his mother's heart. Azula, on the other hand, was already showing a cruel edge at a very young age. As kids, Azula would entertain herself by throwing bread at turtle ducks, while Zuko tried to stop her because he actually felt bad for them. Ozai encouraged that harshness in Azula. He pushed both children to compete, to dominate, and to see each other as rivals instead of siblings. Their mother, Ursa, hated what Ozai was turning them into. She saw the damage being done and even tried to escape with both children, hoping to get them away from his influence. But before she could succeed, she was caught. That upbringing still affects Zuko. Part of him knows the difference between right and wrong, but another part of him is still desperate to prove himself to his father, and that conflict keeps pulling him apart. Back in jailing, Toph finally refuses to live under her parents' version of who she is. She tells them she's not some delicate flower they can keep locked away. She's a rock, solid, stubborn, and impossible to control. Then she makes her choice and runs away with Team Avatar. Her parents are furious. Instead of accepting that their daughter has chosen her own path, they hire the Boulder to track her down and drag her home by force. With Toph now officially part of the group, Team Avatar continues toward Ba Sing Se. As they get closer to the city, Toph senses something moving beneath the ground, following them from a distance. She quickly realizes they're being tracked. To protect the refugees, Toph comes up with a plan. She and Aang will make themselves the obvious targets and lead the pursuers away, while Sokka and Katara guide everyone else safely toward the city. It doesn't take long for Aang and Toph to discover who's after them: a bounty hunters sent by Toph's wealthy parents, hired specifically to bring her back whether she wants to return or not. Toph decides to use the ambush as a teaching opportunity. Since Aang needs to learn earthbending, she tries to turn the whole situation into a practical lesson. But Aang struggles badly. Earthbending doesn't come naturally to him at all, and the chaos around him only makes it worse. Everyone starts yelling advice at once, even the bounty hunters. In the middle of the fight, Aang gets completely overwhelmed. In the end, instead of using earthbending, he falls back on what he already knows and knocks the bounty hunters out with waterbending. When they finally arrive near the border of Ba Sing Se, they hear familiar voices coming from inside the wall. Their friends have already been arrested and locked in cages. Luckily, Toph knows exactly how to handle the situation. She reveals her Beifong family name, and the guard's attitude changes instantly. Suddenly everyone is treated with respect. The prisoners are released, and the refugees are allowed into the city. Getting the refugees safely inside Ba Sing Se was supposed to finish the job, but the moment they arrive, that changes. Sokka the Mechanist wait. Actually it's the Mechanist warning them, not Sokka warns them about the return of Sozin's Comet, a powerful cosmic event that will greatly strengthen Fire Nation firebending. When the comet arrives, the Fire Nation's power could become overwhelming. Aang realizes they can't just wait for that to happen. He wants to meet the Earth King and convince him to prepare the Earth Kingdom army for a preemptive strike before the Fire Nation becomes unstoppable. But reaching the Earth King is much harder than expected. Their assigned guide, Judy, becomes an obstacle almost immediately. On the surface she's cheerful, polite, and always smiling, but underneath that pleasant attitude, she controls every step they take. She keeps them locked into a strict schedule and refuses to let them do anything outside the approved plan. Even when Katara wants to visit sick refugees, Judy blocks her with that same forced, overly pleasant tone. Eventually, the team manages to get invited to an extravagant royal celebration in the upper ring, but once they arrive, it becomes clear that the wealthy citizens of Ba Sing Se are completely disconnected from the war. They live behind their walls as if the outside world no longer exists. The rich and powerful don't seem worried at all. They believe Ba Sing Se is untouchable, protected forever by its massive walls. General Sung, an arrogant Earth Kingdom officer, makes it even clearer when he tells Aang that the suffering beyond the city isn't their problem. Aang tries to go around the system and reach the Earth King directly, but the Dai Li, the royal guard, stop him before he can get close. It feels like another dead end. Then Long Feng appears. He's a powerful minister with enormous influence, and at first he seems surprisingly helpful. He welcomes the team warmly, gives them thoughtful gifts, and acts as though he truly wants to support them. He even promises Aang that he'll personally deliver his message to the Earth King. It sounds sincere enough to believe, but when Long Feng supposedly passes the warning along, the Earth King simply shakes his head after hearing whatever Long Feng says. Aang never gets the chance to speak for himself, and the meeting he needs never happens. Frustrated, tired, and running out of patience, Aang vents to Long Feng about everything the Mechanist told them regarding Sozin's comet. What Aang doesn't realize is that by revealing how much he knows, he's just made himself and his friends a serious threat in Long Feng's eyes. That same night, the Mechanist quietly vanishes. The Dai Li take him without making a sound, and nobody in the city seems to notice a thing. Meanwhile, outside Ba Sing Se, Azula continues hunting Zuko and Dai Ra, chasing them all the way to a crowded port. The place erupts into chaos as people rush toward an escape ship, and Azula shows absolutely no mercy. Anyone who fails to board quickly enough is cut down without hesitation. In the middle of the panic, Ra falls badly, and after that his condition begins to worsen fast. Once they're aboard the ship, Zuko runs into Jet and the freedom fighters. Jet sees an opportunity and proposes a dangerous plan: sneak into the captain's private quarters and steal the food being kept there. Zuko wants nothing to do with it at first, but when Jet mentions that the same room also contains medicine that might help Ra survive, Zuko's resistance fades. The break-in reveals exactly how complicated Jet's sense of justice still is. He talks like he fights for the helpless, but when things get risky, he puts his own people first. After they get into the storeroom, Jet grabs as much food as he can for his crew and then bolts, leaving the others trapped behind. Zuko surprisingly becomes the one who does the right thing. Instead of abandoning everyone, he helps the stranded freedom fighters escape with what supplies are left. Then he makes sure the stolen food is handed out to the starving refugees on the ship's deck. It's the kind of selfless action Zuko keeps pretending he isn't capable of. Jet feels the weight of his own selfishness after seeing it, while the refugees begin looking at Zuko with real respect. The frustrating thing is that Zuko already has those better instincts inside him. He just keeps fighting against them instead of trusting them. Back in Ba Sing Se, several days pass before anyone truly realizes the Mechanist is missing. Sokka has been sliding notes under his door, getting no replies and assuming the man is just busy. Aang, meanwhile, has been spending more time with Long Feng, who continues acting like a helpful ally. His bending is improving too, but there's still one major obstacle holding him back. Aang struggles with what he can't directly sense. He depends too much on what he can see, and because of that, he can't fully connect with the deeper side of his abilities. Katara has been taking a different approach to life in the city. At night, while Judy is asleep, she disguises herself as a Kyoshi warrior, complete with face paint, and sneaks into the lower ring to help people who've been ignored by the wealthy and powerful. The truth finally starts coming out because of professors. The scholar Sokka met at the royal party. When Sokka casually mentions that the Mechanist hasn't answered him for a week, Professors becomes alarmed. He tells Sokka that disappearances aren't unusual in Ba Sing Se. If someone asks too many questions or carries information that threatens the city's perfect image of peace, the Dai Li remove them. Long Feng tries to control the situation by giving Team Avatar an explanation. He claims the Mechanist was taken because he'd once worked as a Fire Nation spy. It's not a complete lie, which makes it more dangerous, because it gives Aang just enough truth to keep trusting him. Aang believes him at first, but then he notices someone following him through the streets. Instead of confronting the man directly, Aang decides to turn the situation around. He lets the spy trail him for a while, then uses airbending to circle behind him and start following the follower. Katara is supposed to keep Judy distracted while Aang does this, but her attention shifts when she spots Jet in the city. That distraction pulls her away from the plan, and without Katara covering for him, Aang ends up captured, but the person behind the surveillance isn't who he expects. Say it's General Sung, and she makes it clear she isn't trying to hurt him. She knows the Fire Nation is gathering outside the city walls. She's been playing along with the official narrative in public because that's what Ba Sing Se demands, but privately she understands the danger is real. Sung needs Aang's help to convince the Earth King before it's too late. She asks him to tell her everything he knows, and Aang explains the truth about Sozin's comet, the Fire Nation threat, and the Mechanist's disappearance. That's when Sung reveals the most disturbing part. Long Feng isn't the friendly minister he pretends to be. He's the real power behind the Dai Li and controls their entire operation from the shadows. Aang reacts emotionally and refuses to accept it right away. Long Feng has treated him like a friend. So Aang storms toward the palace, determined to demand an audience with the Earth King and clear everything up himself. But before he can reach the king, Long Feng stops him. Then he introduces Aang to a brand new Judy, smiling with the same empty cheerfulness as the last one. That's the moment Aang finally understands. The original Judy wasn't just reassigned, she was replaced. He's been manipulated from the beginning. Katara's detour brings her straight to Jet, and what she overhears isn't good. Jet is planning to attack Fire Nation citizens who've been granted shelter inside Ba Sing Se. The tension began after a Fire Nation man treated homeless people cruelly in the street. Zuko, hidden behind the blue spirit disguise, attacked the man, and during the incident, the man's shop caught fire. After that, the neighborhood blamed the Fire Nation refugees as a whole, even though most of them had nothing to do with it. Jet wants to use the anger to push them out of the city, and he even tries to recruit Zuko into the plan. Zuko refuses, seeing how dangerous the situation is becoming. Zuko warns the Fire Nation families to leave before Jet comes for them, but they refuse to run. Instead, they stay and wait for the confrontation to happen. When Jet and his group finally arrive, Zuko appears in his blue spirit mask to defend the refugees. At almost the exact same time, Katara shows up with the same goal. The moment she uses waterbending, Jet recognizes her, and once Zuko sees Katara, he immediately realizes the Avatar must be somewhere nearby. Even now, after everything that's happened, Zuko still can't let go of his obsession. Just as Ba Sing Se's internal problems are getting worse, an even greater danger reaches the city. Azula and her team finally arrive. When Team Avatar first entered Ba Sing Se, the Kyoshi warriors had left because the local government insisted there was no war and claimed their protection was unnecessary. But while traveling away from the city, the warriors discovered the Fire Nation army moving toward Ba Sing Se. Before they could return and warn anyone, Azula and her companions ambushed them. The Kyoshi warriors were defeated, captured, and sent away to a Fire Nation prison. Azula and her companions waste no time making use of the warriors' stolen uniforms. Dressed as the very people Ba Sing Se trusts, they march straight into the city without raising suspicion. To make their disguise even more convincing, they bring a captured Earth Kingdom general with them as a prisoner, presenting him like proof that they've bravely defeated a Fire Nation attack. The citizens believe every word of it and they welcome the so-called heroes warmly, never realizing that the most dangerous Fire Nation threat has just walked through their gates wearing the face of their allies. Meanwhile, Team Avatar needs solid evidence about Sozin's comet if they're going to convince the Earth King. Rumors and warnings won't be enough anymore. Professor suggests there may be one place where they can find the exact date of the comet's arrival. A legendary spiritual library once owned by Wan Shi Tong, the spirit of knowledge. But the library isn't just sitting in the desert waiting to be found. Years ago, Wan Shi Tong pulled it into the spirit world after humans used the knowledge inside to fuel war and destruction. All that remains in the physical world is a spiritual scar, a faint trace of where the library used to be. Because Jet knows the surrounding area better than anyone, he helps guide the group to the location. Once they find the scar, Aang projects the team into the spirit world, bringing them face to face with Wan Shi Tong's hidden library. The spirit doesn't welcome them at first. He has no love for humans, and for good reason. The last time people entered his library, Fire Nation soldiers found information that could be used against their enemies and burned part of the collection to keep it from helping them. Professors manages to change his mind by offering a scroll from a previous scholar. The library works through exchange, and knowledge must be traded for knowledge. Wan Shi Tong accepts the offering, but he gives them one firm warning: nothing they discover inside can be used for battle, warfare, or any kind of attack. Once they're allowed in, the group separates and begins searching through the endless shelves. Aang encounters the spirit of Avatar Kuryuk, who gives him a warning that hits hard: if an avatar is killed while in the avatar state, the entire cycle of reincarnation ends. There will be no next avatar, no continuation. Everything stops with Aang. It's a reminder that his greatest power is also his greatest risk. Elsewhere in the library, Katara and Jet discover what's left of Jet's old freedom fighter group, and the moment forces Jet's pain to the surface. His bitterness suddenly makes more sense. Most of his friends were killed in the war. They were only children, convinced they were strong enough to handle the fight until the reality of war crushed that belief. Jet has been carrying the guilt ever since in his mind. He led them into something they were never ready for. Katara tries to reach him, telling him he can't keep punishing himself. They were kids trapped inside a war far bigger and uglier than any of them understood. The real breakthrough comes from Toph. Of all people, she encounters the spirit of Avatar Kyoshi, who reveals something crucial. Sozin's comet may increase firebending to terrifying levels, but there's another celestial event that does the exact opposite: a solar eclipse known as the Day of Black Sunday. During that eclipse, firebenders lose their bending completely. That becomes their opening. Sokka, following a spirit fox through the library, finds a celestial chart that could help them calculate exactly when the next eclipse will happen. The team gathers around the chart, trying to narrow down the date that could change the course of the war. But before they can secure the information safely, Professor betrays them. He goes directly to Wan Shi Tong and tells the spirit that the group plans to use the library's knowledge for war. Wan Shi Tong explodes with anger to him. This is exactly why humans can't be trusted with knowledge, but doesn't escape judgment either. Wan Shi Tong despises betrayal just as much as violence, and becomes the first to suffer the consequences. The massive owl spirit turns on the entire group, chasing them through the library as they race desperately toward the exit. Toph is the first to make it back to the physical world, but the danger doesn't end there. Wan Shi Tong starts collapsing the library's entrance from the physical side, trying to seal everyone inside the spirit world forever. Toph plants herself firmly in place and uses every bit of strength she has to hold the structure up with earthbending, buying the others just enough time to escape. But there's a cost. While she's focused on keeping the library from crushing them all, she can't defend anything outside, and in that vulnerable moment, Appa is attacked and taken by unknown assailants. Back inside the library, Jet makes one final choice. He sacrifices himself to distract Wan Shi Tong long enough for the others to reach the exit. Thanks to him, the team gets out alive. But when Aang returns to the physical world, relief isn't what comes out of him. He's furious. Appa is gone, and in his pain, Aang turns the anger on Toph, blaming her for not protecting him. Even with Appa and the team shaken, the discovery of the eclipse gives them something they can't ignore: a real chance to stop the Fire Nation. Now they need to get the information directly to Earth King Kuai. General Sung helps them sneak into the palace by hiding them inside a wine delivery cart, allowing them to slip past the guards without being stopped. When they finally meet the king, they realize just how carefully Long Feng has shaped him. Kuai isn't cruel or power-hungry. He's gentle, sheltered, and painfully naive. He spends his time caring for his garden, completely unaware of the war tearing the world apart beyond the city walls. He isn't ruling Ba Sing Se in any meaningful way. He's a figurehead kept innocent on purpose. Team Avatar tells him everything, hoping the truth will finally break through. But before they can fully convince him, Long Feng arrives and starts tearing their credibility apart piece by piece. He mentions Katara's secret activities as a Kyoshi warrior, claiming she's been stirring unrest in the lower ring. He exposes the fact that Toph's family has been supplying machines to the Fire Nation. He identifies the Mechanist as a Fire Nation informant and points out that Sokka was close to him. Every accusation contains just enough truth to make the team look suspicious. Long Feng doesn't need to lie completely, he only needs to twist reality until the king no longer knows who to trust. Then the king turns to General Sung and asks her directly whether Team Avatar is telling the truth. Sung says they're lying, but not because she believes Long Feng. She does it because Long Feng has her daughter, leaving her trapped with no real choice. Still, King Kui doesn't dismiss everything he's heard. One fact clearly bothers him. Long Feng hid the presence of an entire Fire Nation army gathering near the border. That kind of deception can't be explained away so easily. Quietly furious, the king begins calling for strategic meetings. But the damage has already spread too far. When Team Avatar returns home, Aang finally loses control of everything he's been holding inside. Still grieving up his disappearance and overwhelmed by betrayal, pressure, and fear, he lashes out at his friends. Aang had been completely unaware of almost everything Long Feng brought up, and that realization hits the group hard. While they were supposed to be working together, each of them had been running around bossing, chasing their own problems, keeping secrets, and making separate choices without telling the others. Katara immediately turns her anger towards Sokka. She's furious that he knew about Toph's family supplying machines to the Fire Nation and never said anything, especially since those kinds of machines have been used to herd Water Tribe people and destroy their homes. Sokka tries to defend himself, explaining that he only learned about it a few days earlier when someone attempted to blackmail him, but by then, emotions are already too high for the explanation to matter. One by one, everyone says something they shouldn't have. The argument cuts deep, and instead of pulling together, the team breaks apart. Each of them storms off in a different direction, and naturally, every single path leads straight into danger. Sokka goes looking for Suki after hearing that the Kyoshi warriors are supposedly in the city, but the moment he arrives, Azula's companions are waiting for him. Before he can react, they paralyze him and take him down. Katara heads back into the lower ring, continuing her secret vigilante work, only to walk directly into a trap set for her. Toph is betrayed in an even more personal way. Her own mother has her tea poisoned, then kidnaps her and begins taking her back home by force. And then there's Zuko. On the day Team Avatar entered the spirit world, Zuko had found their bodies lying unconscious in the physical world. He stood right over Aang with a perfect chance to capture the Avatar and finally get what he'd always claimed he wanted, but he couldn't do it. Something inside him stopped him, whether he wants to admit it or not. Zuko was trying to become someone else. Earlier that same day, he'd seen a woman struggling to calm her crying baby. Later, wearing the blue spirit mask, he secretly left a toy for the child. It's a small act, but for Zuko, it says a lot. When he hears that Katara has been ambushed, he goes after her to help. Unfortunately, that rescue attempt doesn't go as planned. Zuko and Katara both end up captured and thrown into the same dungeon cell. Back at their hideout, Aang is alone, and in that quiet moment, he remembers what Toph tried to teach him, that earthbending isn't only about seeing what's in front of you, it's about listening through the ground, feeling vibrations, and understanding what the earth is telling you. Aang has always relied on his eyes when he bends, but this time he closes himself off from sight and focuses on sensing. Deep beneath the city, through the stone and soil, he finally hears something. Appa immediately goes searching for help and learns about an underground prison hidden beneath Ba Sing Se. When he goes to inspect the area, he finds Aang there as well. Aira has discovered that Zuko has been arrested, and he knows of a secret entrance built long ago by Avatar Kyoshi herself. There's only one problem. The entrance can only be opened using all four elements. With Aira providing fire, Aang is able to complete the requirement, and together they make their way inside. They find and rescue Sokka first, then continue deeper until they reach the cell holding Katara and Zuko. Katara had never known the true identity of the masked figure who'd helped her before, so when she learns that the blue spirit was actually Zuko all along, Her anger explodes. Zuko doesn't make excuses. He tells her directly that he wants to change, that he wants to become a better person. And strangely, the way he says it feels honest enough that Katara starts to believe him. Then Zuko opens up about his scar. He explains that fire doesn't truly burn a firebender unless that firebender allows it to, and the reason his father's flame scarred him so badly is because deep down, Zuko believed he deserved the punishment. Katara has been carrying the spirit oasis water with her, saving it for a moment that truly matters. Listening to Zuko, seeing the pain beneath all his anger, she almost decides to use it on him. For one brief moment, it seems like she might heal his scar, but before she can do anything, they're interrupted, and just like that, Zuko's redemption falls apart almost as soon as it begins. After sneaking into Ba Sing Se disguised as one of the Kyoshi warriors, Azula quickly figures out the truth of the city. The Earth King may wear the crown, but he isn't the one holding real power. So Azula creates her own opportunity. She causes a scene in the marketplace by using firebending openly, allowing the Dai Li to arrest her and bring her straight to Long Feng. Once face to face with him, she offers a deal. If Long Feng helps her capture the Avatar and Zuko, she'll help him remove everyone standing in the way of his control over Ba Sing Se. Long Feng accepts. He has General Sung arrested, clearing away one of his biggest threats. But then he makes the fatal mistake of bringing Azula with him to speak before the Earth Kingdom Council. Azula was never planning to serve Long Feng's agenda. She doesn't want to help him protect his power, she wants the entire kingdom for herself. So she kills the council members and takes command of the Dai Li. Long Feng realizes far too late that he's handed control of Ba Sing Se to someone colder, smarter, and far more dangerous than he ever was. When Aang later crosses paths with Long Feng trying to escape the city, Long Feng tells him what Azula has done. The coup is already unfolding, and Ba Sing Se is collapsing from the inside. Azula then finds Zuko and offers him the one thing he's been chasing from the very beginning, a path back home, his banishment erased, his honor restored, his place in the Fire Nation returned. Ba Sing Se has already fallen into their hands, and all Zuko has to do is stand beside her. And after coming so close to choosing the right path, Zuko gives in almost immediately. He turns against Team Avatar. With Azula controlling the Dai Li and her allies already inside the city walls, the battle becomes overwhelming fast. Toph manages to escape after her mother locks her inside by bending the metal itself, becoming the first earthbender to ever do so. She joins the fight, but even her incredible new ability can't overcome the sheer number of enemies surrounding them. Aang is pushed to the edge and enters the Avatar state. His power surges, forcing their enemies back, and for a moment it looks like he may be able to stop Azula. But when he gets the chance to end the fight, he hesitates. Azula doesn't. She strikes him directly through the chest with lightning. Aira steps in and holds Zuko and Azula back long enough for Katara to reach Aang and escape with him. Appa, finally free, carries Team Avatar into the sky as Ba Sing Se falls beneath them. Katara takes out the spirit oasis water and uses every last drop on Aang, desperately trying to save him, but the outcome remains uncertain. Aang comes back for only a brief moment, then slips unconscious again, and the danger is bigger than anyone realizes. Aang was struck while in the Avatar state. If he dies now, the entire Avatar cycle could be broken forever. As Team Avatar vanishes into the distance, the Fire Nation army marches into Ba Sing Se. The great city has fallen, and Fire Lord Ozai has just secured the biggest victory of the 100-Year War. So, the easiest way to describe Netflix is Avatar: The Last Airbender is this: it's not a disaster, but it's also not the grand victory lap fans were probably hoping for. And honestly, that's where the show lives for most of its first season, somewhere in the middle. Sometimes it looks genuinely impressive, sometimes it feels like the people behind it really do care about this world, and then other times, you can feel the cracks. The acting gets shaky, the writing gets too heavy, the pacing either rushes through something important or slows down in places where it should be moving with more energy. But I don't want to pretend there's nothing here, because there is. As a fantasy series, it does work on a basic level. The world is interesting, the elemental bending gives the show a strong visual identity, and there are enough strong moments sprinkled through the season to keep it from feeling like a waste of time. It has atmosphere, it has scale, it has that big adventure feeling in flashes, even if it doesn't always hold on to it for long. The strange thing is, I never felt like the show was completely falling apart. It's more like it keeps almost getting there. You'll have a scene where the visuals look great, or a character moment that starts to land emotionally, and you think, okay, now we're getting into it. Then suddenly the dialogue gets stiff, or the scene explains too much, or the energy drops, and you're reminded that this version still hasn't fully found its rhythm. That's probably the most frustrating part. It's not bad enough to dismiss, but it's not strong enough to fully celebrate either. If you're coming into this as someone who's never watched the animated series, I can see this being a pretty solid fantasy watch. You get the simple but effective setup, a lost avatar, a world out of balance, a violent fire nation, and a young hero who has to grow into a responsibility much bigger than himself. That stuff works. It's easy to follow, easy to get invested in, and the season does a decent job giving you enough reason to keep watching. But if you grew up with the original or even if you watched it recently, this live-action version has a much harder battle, because the animated show had this rare mix of humor, emotion, adventure, and character growth that felt effortless. This one feels like it's trying, sometimes trying very hard, and you can respect the effort, but you can also feel the weight of it. There are moments where the show feels too careful, too polished, too serious, almost like it's afraid to relax and just let the characters breathe. And that matters, because Avatar was never only about the plot, it was about the journey, the friendships, the small jokes, the quiet moments between big battles, the feeling that these kids weren't just running from one major event to the next, but actually growing together. This version understands the story mostly, but it doesn't always understand the pulse of the story. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't find parts of it enjoyable. The season has enough visual spectacle, enough sincere performances, and enough respect for the source material to make it worth talking about. It's not the lifeless failure some people feared, and it's definitely a step above that old live-action movie everyone tries not to think about for too long. But at the same time, it's not the kind of adaptation that makes the original feel replaced. Not even close. For me, this first season feels like a foundation, a rough one, maybe, but not a broken one. There's potential here. You can see where the show could improve if the writing becomes sharper, if the actors grow more comfortable, if the story slows down just enough to let the characters feel human instead of constantly pushing them through plot points. So overall, Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender is a solid but uneven start. It has heart, but not always enough. It has spectacle, but not always magic. It has respect for the original, but it still hasn't fully captured what made that original feel so alive. And maybe that's the fairest verdict. It's a good watch, but not yet a great one. Here's the thing with Avatar, The Last Airbender: this was never going to be judged like a normal fantasy show. It just wasn't. Netflix wasn't adapting some forgotten cartoon that people vaguely remembered from childhood. They were touching one of those rare shows that fans talk about like it changed the weather in their brain. And honestly, for a lot of people, it kind of did. The original animated series has that almost dangerous reputation where every episode, every joke, every character beat, every emotional moment has been rewatched, quoted, defended, and basically protected by fans for years. So before this live-action version even begins, it's already carrying baggage, not just expectations, baggage. Because when a story is already loved that much, the question is no longer is this good, the question becomes why does this need to exist? And that's a much harder question to answer. You can feel that pressure all over the first season. Sometimes it feels like the show is trying very carefully not to upset anyone. It wants to honor the animation, it wants to keep the major story beats, it wants the costumes to look familiar, the bending to feel recognizable, the characters to remind you of the versions you already love. And I get it if they change too much, fans would tear it apart for disrespecting the source. But if they don't change enough, they run into the other problem. They're just asking people to compare them to a version that already worked better. That's the trap this show is stuck in. The animated series had the freedom to be funny, weird, emotional, spiritual, childish, mature, and adventurous all at once. It could move from a goofy Sokka moment to something genuinely tragic without feeling like the tone had snapped in half. That balance is incredibly difficult to recreate in live action, especially when everything suddenly has real faces, real costumes, real sets, and a much heavier sense of seriousness. And to be fair, the Netflix version doesn't feel careless. That's important. You can tell there's respect here. This isn't some lazy cash grab where nobody understands the appeal. The people involved clearly know they're dealing with something important. The problem is that respect alone doesn't create magic. Sometimes the show feels like it's carrying the original on its back instead of walking beside it. That's why even the good moments come with a little asterisk. A bending scene looks cool, but maybe it doesn't feel as fluid as your memory of the animation. A character says something emotional, but maybe the animated version already said it better with less dialogue. A familiar scene appears, and part of you enjoys seeing it recreated, while another part of you thinks, yeah, but I already had the perfect version of this. And that's a brutal position for any adaptation to be in, because the original Avatar isn't just like Tay, it's trusted. Fans trust those characters. They trust that journey. They trust the emotional rhythm of that world. So when the live-action version alters something even slightly, it doesn't feel like a random creative choice. It feels personal. That might sound dramatic, but that's what happens when a show becomes part of someone's childhood. This adaptation was always going to have to fight for every inch of goodwill. And in some places, it earns it. In others, it reminds you exactly why people were nervous in the first place. So yeah, the impossible pressure is real. Netflix didn't just have to make a decent fantasy series, they had to stand next to a beloved classic and somehow not look unnecessary. And that's where this first season struggles most. It's not fighting against bad source material, it's fighting against something that already felt complete. Now, we can't talk about Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, without addressing the ghost standing in the corner, the 2010 movie. And look, I know everyone has already taken turns beating that movie into the ground. At this point, criticizing it almost feels like bullying a corpse, but the reason it keeps coming up is simply that film left a mark, and not a good one. For a lot of fans, it became the worst-case scenario for what happens when you take a beloved animated story and drain every ounce of life out of it. So when Netflix announced another live-action version, people weren't just skeptical, they were traumatized. And that's probably the one area where the 2024 series has an easy win. Whatever problems this show has, and it definitely has problems, it's still miles better than the 2010 version. It actually looks like someone watched the animated series this time. It understands the basic shape of the world. It knows the characters are supposed to have personality. It knows bending should feel exciting. It knows the Fire Nation, the Water Tribe, and the Air Nomads all need to feel like part of one bigger, living universe. That sounds like a low bar, and honestly, it kind of is. But after that movie, even basic respect for the material feels like a relief. The Netflix version at least tries to make the world feel grand. The bending has weight. The costumes and sets are recognizable. The mythology is treated with some level of care. Aang isn't just a blank-faced chosen one being pushed through scenes. Zuko actually gets emotional focus. Airal gets moments of warmth and wisdom, even if not all of them land perfectly. Ozai feels like a real presence instead of just a name waiting in the background. So yes, compared to the movie, this series is absolutely an improvement. But here's the tricky part. Being better than the 2010 movie doesn't automatically make it great. That's where some of the praise gets complicated, because a lot of the time people defend this show by saying, well, at least it's not that movie. And sure, fair, it isn't, thank God. But eventually, the show has to stand on its own. It can't survive forever just by pointing to a worse adaptation and saying, See, we did better than that, because the real comparison was never only the 2010 film. The real comparison is the animated series, and that's where Netflix's version starts looking much more uneven. Against the movie, it feels respectful, energetic, and far more complete. Against the cartoon, it feels heavier, stiffer, and less emotionally natural. The movie failed because it misunderstood almost everything. The series is more frustrating because it understands a lot of things but still struggles to make them feel alive. That's a very different kind of disappointment. The 2010 movie was the kind of adaptation where you sit there wondering how so many obvious things went wrong. The Netflix show is the kind where you can see the good intentions and you can see the money on screen. You can see the actors trying, but you still find yourself thinking, why isn't this hitting harder? And in a strange way, that makes this version harder to dismiss, because it's not a disaster. It's not some soulless wreck that you can just laugh off and move on from. It has enough good pieces to make you want it to work. It gives fans actual moments to enjoy. It gives newcomers a much cleaner entry point into the story. It proves that a live-action Avatar doesn't have to be embarrassing, but it also proves something else. Escaping the shadow of the 2010 movie is only step one. The bigger challenge is capturing the spirit of Avatar itself, and that's where this series is still finding its footing. So yes, Netflix cleared the lowest bar easily. The problem is Avatar was never supposed to be judged by the lowest bar. The basic setup of Avatar, The Last Airbender, is still one of the cleanest fantasy premises you can ask for. You have a world divided by 4 elements: water, earth, fire, and air. Each nation has people who can bend one of those elements, shape it, fight with it, live through it, and above all of them, there's the Avatar, the one person who can master all 4 and keep balance between the nations. Simple idea, big playground. And that's probably why this story has always worked so well. You don't need a 20-minute lecture to understand the conflict. The Fire Nation has become too powerful. The world is out of balance. The one person who was supposed to stop that disappeared for 100 years. And when he finally comes back, he's not some battle-hardened warrior with perfect control over destiny. He's a kid. That detail matters more than anything. Aang isn't introduced as this mighty, untouchable savior. He wakes up after a century frozen in ice, and the world he knew is basically gone. His people are gone. The Fire Nation has spread its influence everywhere. The war has already damaged generations of people before he even gets a chance to understand what happened. So right away, the show has a strong emotional hook underneath the fantasy mechanics. Yes, it's about bending elements, battles, tribes, nations, and magical destiny, but really, it's about a child being handed a responsibility that would crush most adults. That's the part the live-action version does understand, at least on paper. The world itself has enough texture to pull you in. The Water Tribe has its own identity. The Fire Nation feels aggressive and organized. The Air Nomads carry this tragic sense of absence, because we're introduced to them through what was lost. And the idea of one avatar connecting all of these worlds gives the story a natural sense of movement. Every new place can reveal a new culture, a new wound from the war, or a new piece of Aang's role. That's strong fantasy storytelling, and the show does benefit from how clear the central journey is. Aang has to learn the elements. Katara and Sokka join him. The Fire Nation wants him captured or destroyed. Zuko is hunting him for his own reasons. Everyone is moving towards something, even when the season rushes. The spine of the story is never confusing. You always understand what's at stake. The Fire Nation isn't just some random villain army in the background. Their domination has changed the shape of the world. Villages are afraid. Cultures are damaged. Families have been separated. People have built their entire lives around surviving a war that started long before many of them were born. So when Aang returns, his arrival doesn't feel small, it feels like a myth suddenly becoming real again. That's a great engine for a show. Where the live-action version becomes uneven is in how it delivers that world. The premise is powerful, but sometimes the show explains it too neatly. Characters will say the important thing out loud when the scene could have trusted the audience to feel it. The world is already interesting and the bending already tells us so much. The ruins, the costumes, the fear of the Fire Nation, the way people react to hearing the Avatar is back, all of that can speak for itself. But even with those issues, the foundation still works. Because Avatar has the kind of story that naturally pulls you forward. A lost hero, a broken world, elemental powers, a war that feels bigger than any single character, a villainous nation with personal conflicts inside it, a young team that has to grow before they're ready. That's why even when the adaptation stumbles, the premise keeps it alive. The show may not always capture the full magic of the original, but the world of Avatar is still strong enough to survive the transition. You can feel why people love this universe, you can see why newcomers get pulled in, and even when the execution gets messy, the core idea remains incredibly watchable. A world out of balance, a boy who disappeared, a war that never stopped, and one Avatar who has to grow up fast enough to save everyone. This is one of the weirdest things about Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender. Your reaction to it probably depends a lot on what you brought with you before pressing play. If you're coming into this world fresh, with no childhood attachment, no memory of the animated series, no favorite episode sitting in the back of your mind, I can honestly see the show working much better. You get a big fantasy setup, elemental powers, a lost hero, a dangerous Fire Nation, a young team traveling through a war-torn world. There's enough action, enough visual spectacle, and enough mythology to make it feel like a solid adventure series. Maybe not flawless, but easy to watch, easy to binge, easy to enjoy without constantly pausing in your head to compare every scene to something else. And that matters. A newcomer doesn't necessarily care if a character's personality has been softened. They don't know what joke was removed. They don't know which storyline was combined with another, or which emotional beat used to land harder in the animation. They're not sitting there thinking, wait, why is this happening so early? Or that moment used to mean more. They're just watching the story unfold. And from that angle, the Netflix version has a decent amount going for it. The premise is strong, the bending looks cool, the world is easy to understand, and the season gives you a clear reason to keep moving forward. If this is your first real introduction to Avatar, I can understand finishing the 8 episodes and thinking, yeah, that was pretty good, I'd watch more. But for longtime fans, it's a completely different experience, because they're not just watching what's on screen, they're also feeling what's missing. That's where the adaptation starts to struggle. Fans of the animated series remember the warmth, they remember the humor, they remember how Aang and Sokka slowly became a little found family, instead of just 3 characters running from one plot point to the next. They remember how the show could be silly one minute and emotionally devastating the next, without making either side feel cheap. So when the live-action version rushes through a moment, or flattens a character, or replaces playful energy with serious dialogue, fans notice immediately. And I get why that becomes frustrating. The original wasn't loved just because the story was good, it was loved because of how this story breathed. The little pauses mattered, the jokes mattered, the awkward kid behavior mattered. Even the episodes that felt smaller on the surface were often building the relationships that made the bigger moments hit later. The Netflix version sometimes feels like it understands the plot better than it understands the experience of watching the original. That's probably why the reaction has been so split. New viewers may see a polished fantasy show with strong effects and a cool world. Longtime fans may see an adaptation that keeps the skeleton but loses some of the heartbeat. Neither reaction is fake, they're just 2 completely different ways of watching. There are also fans somewhere in the middle, people who love the original but still went in with an open mind. They may enjoy seeing bending in live action, they may appreciate Zuko's material, or the Fire Nation scenes, or the effort put into the visuals. But even then, there's usually that small voice in the background saying, this is fine, but the original did it better. And that's the adaptation's biggest problem, not that it's impossible to enjoy. It is, in places, But if you already know how rich this story can feel, the live-action version often feels like a good-looking version of something deeper. For newcomers, it may be an entry point. For fans, it feels more like a test of patience, nostalgia, fairness, and how much change you're willing to accept before the thing you love starts feeling a little too different. So I don't think there's one clean answer here. If this is your first trip into the world of Avatar, Netflix gives you enough to be entertained. But if you grew up with the animated series, this version is harder to embrace without reservation, because you're not just asking, is this good? You're asking, does this still feel like Avatar? And depending on what the original meant to you, the answer might change from episode to episode. The Netflix version of Avatar, The Last Airbender, is in a strange position, because in a lot of ways it really is trying to be faithful. You can see that almost immediately. This isn't an adaptation that throws the whole thing out and says, don't worry, we know better. It follows the same basic journey. Aang is still the lost Avatar, Katara and Sokka still find him, the Fire Nation is still the threat hanging over the world, Zuko is still chasing the Avatar with a wounded intensity, and the larger shape of Book 1 is still very recognizable. So if we're talking about surface-level faithfulness, the show does a decent job. It recreates familiar locations. It brings back important characters. It includes side stories and moments that fans will instantly recognize. You can feel the creators looking back at the animated series and trying to honor what was already there. Even some smaller callbacks are clearly designed to make longtime viewers smile, like the Cabbage Merchant moment or certain beats pulled directly from the original. And honestly, that kind of effort matters. After the damage done by the previous live-action movie, just seeing a version that actually respects the names, the mythology, the nations, and the basic emotional direction of the story feels like a relief. The Netflix series understands that this world has rules. It understands that bending isn't just a random superpower. It understands that Aang's return means something bigger than just one kid waking up from ice. But faithfulness is complicated, because sometimes the show keeps the story but changes the feeling. And that's where things get messy. A scene can be technically similar to the animated version and still not hit the same way. A character can wear the right costume, say the right kind of line, stand in the right place, and somehow still feel slightly off. That's the difficult part of adapting something like Avatar. You can copy the map, but if the emotional rhythm is wrong, the journey still feels different. The show also makes changes that are understandable in theory. It only has 8 episodes, so it has to combine material. It has to move faster. It has to reshape certain events so they fit a live-action season. I don't think every change is automatically bad, as some of them are clearly made because Netflix is trying to create bigger, denser episodes instead of copying the cartoon beat for beat. But not every change lands. At times, the season feels like it's pulling pieces from different parts of the original and forcing them into one place before the characters have earned them. Storylines get merged. Characters appear earlier than expected. Certain arcs are shortened or softened. And because of that, some moments that should feel important end up feeling like they were added just because fans would recognize them. That's not the same thing as storytelling. The biggest issue is that the animated series had patience. It could let characters grow slowly. It could let a joke breathe. It could spend time on a small adventure that seemed light but quietly built a relationship. The Netflix version, while mostly loyal to the main plot, often skips that texture. It keeps the big events but trims the connective tissue, and that connective tissue was a huge part of why the original worked. So yes, the show is faithful in many visible ways. It respects the world. It tries to preserve the major story. It wants to satisfy fans rather than insult them. That puts it in a much better place than a careless adaptation. But being faithful isn't just about what happens, it's about why it matters. That's where this version still struggles. It remembers the outline, but it doesn't always capture the personality. It recreates the journey, but it rushes through some of the feeling. It brings the animated series to live action, but sometimes you can feel the soul slipping between the scenes. So I wouldn't call it unfaithful, that feels too harsh. It's more like a respectful adaptation that occasionally misunderstands what needed protecting the most, not just the plot points, not just the costumes, not just the bending, but the warmth, the looseness, the little imperfections in the characters add the sense that this was a story about kids growing up together inside a world at war. That's the version fans remember, and that's the version Netflix is still trying to fully reach. At some point with Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, you run into the question every live-action remake of a beloved animated story has to answer: why does this need to be made? Because obviously it can be. Netflix has the money, the technology is better now, bending can look impressive on screen, and there's a massive fan base ready to click the moment the title appears. From a business angle, I get it completely. A famous name built on nostalgia, fantasy action, younger characters, global appeal. Of course somebody looked at that and said, yeah, let's do it again, but creatively, the question is harder. Because the original animated series is still right there. It hasn't disappeared. It hasn't aged into something unwatchable. It's not one of those old shows where you say, okay, maybe the idea was great, but the execution needs a modern update. The original still works. The humor still works. The emotional scenes still work. The world still feels rich. The characters still feel alive. So the live-action version isn't just competing with memory, it's competing with something people can rewatch today and still love. That puts this adaptation in a really awkward position. If it follows the original too closely, you start wondering why you wouldn't just watch the animated version. If it changes too much, fans ask why it even bothered calling itself Avatar. There's almost no comfortable lane for it. It either feels unnecessary or risky. And sometimes it seems to know that. You can sense the show trying to justify itself through scale, bigger visuals, more serious tone, heavier drama, more cinematic bending, more direct conflict. It wants to say, look, this is Avatar with the weight of live action. This is the version you imagined when you were younger. And in certain moments, I understand the appeal. Seeing the elements brought to life can be exciting. Seeing familiar locations with real sets and effects has its own charm. There's something satisfying about watching the childhood fantasy world become physical, but that novelty only carries the show so far. After the first wave of recognition fades, the series has to offer something that feels necessary, and that's where it struggles. Too often, it feels like it's retelling a story that already had better timing, better character chemistry, and a clearer emotional rhythm. It has the look of a prestige fantasy series, but the reason for its existence never becomes fully convincing. And I don't think that means the show is worthless. That would be too simple. There are people who will discover Avatar through this version. There are viewers who don't watch animation, or who never gave the original a chance, and for them this might be the door into the world. That counts for something. A live-action adaptation can bring a story to a new audience, and this one does have enough strong material to make that possible. But for fans who already know the animated series, the live-action version has to do more than exist. It has to add something, not just extra scenes, not just more exposition, not just darker lighting and bigger fire blasts. It has to make you feel like this version has a reason to stand beside the original. And right now, I'm not sure it fully does. That's probably why the show can feel so frustrating even when it's decent. If it were terrible, the conversation would be easy. We'd all point at it, complain for a week, and move on. But because it's competent, because it has effort behind it, because some parts genuinely work, it becomes harder to dismiss. You end up watching it and thinking, okay, this isn't bad. But why am I watching this instead of the version that already nailed the same material? That question keeps following the season. It follows the serious tone, it follows the rushed character arcs, it follows the scenes that recreate familiar moments but don't quite hit the same emotional note. It follows every moment where the show seems proud of simply translating something into live action, as if translation itself were enough. And maybe for some viewers, it is enough. Maybe seeing bending in live action, seeing Aang and Zuko and Katara and Sokka as real people, Seeing the Fire Nation and Water Tribe rebuilt with modern effects, maybe that's the appeal, and I can respect that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to see a beloved world through a different lens, but for me, the remake still feels like it's searching for its own purpose. It proves that a live-action Avatar can be watchable. It proves that the material can survive outside animation better than the 2010 movie suggested, but it doesn't yet prove that this version needed to exist as anything more than another version, and that's the real challenge going forward. Not just to be faithful, not just to be better than the old movie, but to become something that feels essential in its own right, because when the original is already great, not bad isn't enough of a reason. One of the biggest problems with Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender is that the show always feels like it's in a hurry, not in a fun, exciting, we're on an adventure kind of way, but more like the season has a checklist hidden behind the camera, and every episode is trying to cross off as much as possible before the credits roll. You can feel the Netflix structure working against the story. The animated version had room. It could take a small detour. It could let the characters get lost somewhere. It could spend an episode on a side adventure that didn't seem massive at first, but later you realized it had quietly built the bond between Aang, Katara, and Sokka. Those little episodes mattered. They gave the world texture. They let the characters be funny, annoying, immature, brave, selfish, kinda basically human. The live-action version doesn't have that luxury, or at least it acts like it doesn't. With only 8 episodes, the show tries to fold a lot of material into bigger, longer chapters. On paper, that probably sounds smart to take multiple animated episodes, combine the important parts, give everything a larger cinematic shape, and keep the story moving for modern streaming audiences. I understand the logic. Nobody wants a live-action season that feels like it's wandering around aimlessly. But Avatar is not a story that works only because of big plot movement. It works because of the small things between the big plot movement. That's what this version keeps losing. A character shows up, and before they can really settle into the story, we're already being pushed toward the next location. A major emotional beat happens, but the show doesn't always give it enough silence afterward. Storylines from different parts of the original are pulled together, and sometimes they technically connect, but emotionally they feel cramped. It's like the writers are so afraid of boring the audience that they never let the audience sit with anything, and weirdly, that makes the show feel slower sometimes, because rushing plot doesn't automatically create momentum. If anything, too much compression can make a season feel heavy. You get long conversations explaining what matters, characters spelling out their pain, exposition stacked on top of exposition, and suddenly the show feels dense instead of exciting. It's moving fast but not breathing. That's the strange contradiction here. The season is rushed, but it can still feel draggy. It races through character development, but then pauses for dialogue that says what the development should have shown. It pushes through major events, but some scenes still feel overloaded. It wants action movie pacing. But Avatar was never just an action story. It was travel story, a friendship story, a coming-of-age story, a war story, yes, but one told through kids who were still allowed to be kids. This version often feels panic-stricken, as if it's scared someone might click away if Aang and the group spend too long just existing together. And I think that's a mistake. Because the original didn't become beloved because every minute was plot efficient. It became beloved because the characters had space to grow. Sokka could be rude or sarcastic and then slowly mature. Katara could struggle, argue, hope, and become stronger. Aang could be playful one moment and crushed by grief the next. Those shifts need time. They can't just be squeezed between the next big location and the next visual effects scene. The compression also hurts the world building. The world of Avatar is supposed to feel huge. But when the show jumps too quickly from one storyline to another, the world can start to feel smaller. Places become stops on a route instead of cultures with their own rhythm. Supporting characters become reminders of things fans recognize rather than people who fully live inside the story. And that's frustrating, because you can see the potential when the show slows down even a little. it improves. The stronger later episodes suggest this adaptation can work when it lets a moment land. Certain scenes with Zuko, Aira, or the Fire Nation side have more weight because they aren't always rushing toward the next familiar event. They have a little more space to build tension, a little more patience. That's what the whole season needed, not necessarily 20 episodes. I understand that live action is expensive. You can't just copy the animated structure one for one and expect it to work the same way. But 8 episodes feels too tight for what this story is trying to carry. 10 episodes might have helped. 12 would have helped even more. Just enough extra room for the characters to breathe, joke, fail, bond, and become more than pieces being moved across the plot. Because right now, the season often feels like it's adapting the memory of Book 1 rather than the full experience of it. It remembers the important stops and it just forgets that the journey between them was the point. The more I watched Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, the more I kept thinking the same thing. This season needed more room. Not necessarily a massive 20-episode run like the animated show. I get why that was never realistic. A live action is expensive. Every bending scene costs money. Every creature, set, costume, location, and battle has to be built in a way animation doesn't have to worry about the same way. So no, I wasn't expecting Netflix to recreate the original structure episode for episode. But 8 episodes feels tight, too tight, and you can feel it in the way the season moves. It's not just that events happen quickly. It's that the characters don't always get the time they need after those events happen. They go through something emotional, and then the story is already dragging them into the next major plot point. A new location appears, a familiar character is introduced, a conflict starts, and before the atmosphere can really settle, we're off again. It makes the world feel busy instead of expansive. That's a problem, because Avatar is supposed to feel like a journey. You're supposed to feel the distance between places. You're supposed to feel the group becoming closer through travel, danger, boredom, arguments, jokes, and random little detours. The original understood that the road mattered just as much as the destination. This version often feels like it only has time for the destination, and honestly, that hurts the main trio the most. Aang, Katara, and Sokka need breathing room more than anyone else. They're kids, they shouldn't just be delivering plot information and reacting to trauma every few scenes. They need those small, slightly messy moments where they irritate each other, laugh at something stupid, make mistakes, and slowly become a family. That kind of bond can't be rushed. You can tell the show wants us to feel their friendship. It doesn't always let us experience it. It tells us they care. It places them together. It gives them shared danger. But friendship in a story like this is built in the quieter spaces. The scenes where nothing huge is technically happening, but everything important is happening underneath. A little more time could have changed so much. A 10-episode season might have allowed certain storylines to land more naturally. 12 episodes could have given the show room to separate some of the combined plots. Even 13 episodes would probably have made the whole thing feel less panicked, not slower in a boring way, slower in a human way, because there's a difference between pacing and patience. A show can move forward while still letting characters breathe. It can keep stakes high without turning every episode into a compressed package of major moments. It can trust that viewers will stay invested because they care about the people, not just because another big thing is happening every 10 minutes. That's where Netflix's version sometimes seems unsure of itself. It feels like it's afraid that if the story pauses, the audience will leave. But with Avatar, those pauses are part of the magic. Aang being playful matters. Sokka making a bad joke matters. Katara getting frustrated matters. Aira quietly giving advice over tea matters. These aren't distractions from the story, they are the story. And when you cut too many of them, the big emotional moments don't have the same weight. You can have all the bending you want. You can have great effects, big music, dramatic speeches, and a polished fantasy world. But if the characters haven't had enough time to feel lived in, then the spectacle starts carrying more weight than the emotions, and that's not where Avatar is strongest. The show needed breathing room to let Aang's grief feel deeper, to let Katara's growth feel earned, to let Sokka's humor and insecurity actually shape him, to let Zuko's obsession build with more tension, to let the world feel like a place being discovered, not just a series of required stops. That doesn't mean everything in the season fails, as some episodes work better than others, and some moments do manage to slow down and connect, but the structure keeps pulling the show forward before it can fully enjoy its own world. And that's frustrating, because the fix feels obvious. More time, not endless time, not filler for the sake of filler, just enough space for the story to inhale before the next fire blast, the next speech, the next chase, the next dramatic reveal. Because this first season has the bones of a strong adaptation. It has the setup, it has the world, it has characters people already want to love, but it keeps squeezing them into a season shape that feels too small for the story being told. And by the end, I didn't feel like the show lacked ambition, I felt like it lacked air. The pacing in Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, is one of those problems that doesn't always hit you in one obvious way. It's not simply too fast, and it's not simply too slow, somehow it manages to be both. There are episodes where the show feels like it's sprinting through major events, throwing characters, locations, conflicts, and emotional reveals at us before we've had enough time to really settle into any of them. Then, almost immediately after that, you'll get these long stretches of dialogue where everything slows down, but not in a natural or emotional way, more in a character standing around explaining what the scene already told us kind of way. That's what makes the pacing feel uneven. It rushes the wrong things and lingers on the wrong things. The original animated series had a rhythm that made its world feel alive. Some episodes were big and important, sure, but others were smaller. Some were goofy, some were strange, some felt like little side quests. And at the time, you might not even realize how much they were doing for the characters, but later, when the emotional stakes got heavier, all those little moments paid off. The Netflix version doesn't always have that rhythm. It feels more anxious, like every episode is trying to prove it matters, and that creates a crowded feeling. Instead of letting one storyline breathe, the show will often stack multiple ideas together. A familiar character appears, then another one, then a new location, then a piece of backstory, then a dramatic speech, then an action sequence. It's a lot, and again, some of it is good on its own, but when it's packed together too tightly, the emotional impact starts to blur. You don't always get the satisfaction of discovery, and you get the feeling of being moved along. That's especially noticeable in the middle stretch of the season. There are parts where the show seems to be combining too many stories at once, and instead of feeling rich, it feels messy. You can see the ambition, but you can also see the strain. It wants to honor so much from the original that it sometimes forgets to shape those pieces into something that flows naturally as live action. And the slower moments don't always help either, because a lot of them are filled with exposition. That's the frustrating part. If the show slowed down to let the characters joke, argue, bond, or quietly process what they're going through, I'd be completely fine with that. In fact, that's exactly what it needed more of. But too often, the slower scenes are truly character scenes, they're explanation scenes. People talk about destiny, they talk about responsibility, they talk about pain, they talk about what they're feeling instead of letting us feel it with them. So the season ends up in this awkward place where the plot feels rushed but the scenes can still feel heavy, and that's not a great combination. When the pacing works, though, you can feel the show become more confident. Some of the later episodes have stronger momentum because the stakes are clearer and the emotional focus tightens. The Northern Water Tribe material, for example, has more of that end-of-season weight, and you can tell the show is finally building towards something instead of constantly trying to introduce or rearrange things. But even there, not everything lands as hard as it should. Some viewers found the finale fitting, others found it flat. And honestly, I can understand both reactions. The pieces are there, the scale is there, The visuals are there, but because the season hasn't always given enough time to the relationships and emotional build-up, the ending doesn't hit with the full force it could have had. That's the thing about pacing. It's not just about speed, it's about timing. It's about knowing when to move, when to pause, when to trust silence, when to let a joke sit, when to let a character fail without immediately explaining the lesson, and when to let the audience connect the dots on their own. This adaptation sometimes feels like it doesn't trust those pauses. It wants to keep the story moving, which I understand, but Avatar doesn't become better just because it moves faster. The adventure needs motion, yes, but it also needs breath. It needs those softer spaces between the big moments, because that's where the characters become more than names from the original. By the end of the season, the pacing doesn't ruin the show completely, but it does keep getting in the way. It keeps strong scenes from becoming great scenes. It keeps emotional moments from fully settling. It makes the world feel smaller than it should. And most importantly, it makes the journey feel more like a condensed retelling than a lived experience. And for Avatar, that difference matters a lot. One thing that really starts to weigh down Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender is how much the show talks. And I don't mean normal dialogue. Obviously characters need to speak. This is a fantasy world with history, politics, trauma, bending, war, and spiritual balance. There's a lot to communicate, I get that, but there's a difference between dialogue that reveals character and dialogue that feels like it's explaining the episode to you while you're already watching it. This show falls into that second lane way too often. Characters will say exactly what they're feeling, then explain why they're feeling it, and then another character will respond by explaining what that means for the story. After a while, you start to feel like the writers don't fully trust the audience to understand anything unless someone says it out loud. That's frustrating, because Avatar is already a very visual story. The world can tell us so much by itself. Aang standing in the ruins of what used to be his home tells us more than a speech ever could. Zuko's silence can say more about pain and shame than another line about honor. Katara watching someone suffer under the Fire Nation shouldn't always need extra explanation. The bending, the costumes, the destroyed villages, the fear people carry, all of that is storytelling, but the show keeps adding words on top of it. And after a point those words start flattening the emotion instead of deepening it. There are scenes where you can almost see the stronger version underneath. A character moment begins. The mood is there. The music is there. The actor is trying to hold something back, and then the script steps in and has them say the thing directly, sometimes in the most formal way possible. It's like the show is afraid of subtext. That's where the dialogue can feel stiff. Not every line is bad. To be fair, there are moments that land. Some of the Fire Nation material works better because the tension is clearer and the performances give the words more weight. Zuko and Aira especially get a few scenes where the dialogue actually has some emotional texture. You feel the history between them, the regret, the pressure. But with the main trio, the writing often feels less natural. Aang, Katara, and Sokka should sound like kids who are scared, overwhelmed, excited, annoyed, and slowly becoming friends. Instead, they sometimes sound like they're delivering carefully prepared statements about courage, pain, responsibility, and destiny. Those are important ideas, sure, but when every emotion is announced, the characters stop feeling spontaneous. And that's a problem, because the original Avatar had such a good ear for casual character rhythm. People joked, they interrupted each other, they said dumb things, they got defensive, they misunderstood each other, they acted like kids. Then, when the serious moments came, they hit harder, because the characters hadn't spent every scene speaking like they knew they were inside an important story. The live-action version feels more self-conscious. It wants everything to matter, so it makes everyone talk like everything matters. But if every conversation is heavy, then heaviness stops feeling special. The emotional moments need contrast. They need ordinary moments around them. They need humor. They need awkward pauses. They need characters not always having the perfect line for what the scene is about. That's what gives a story life. The exposition also affects the pacing. Sometimes the show is already rushing through major events, but then it slows down for long explanations. So instead of feeling fast and thrilling, the episode becomes dense. Plot-wise we're moving quickly, but scene by scene we're being stopped for another explanation of something we probably already understood. It's an odd combination, and maybe part of this comes from adaptation anxiety. The writers are dealing with a huge world, a passionate fan base, and only 8 episodes. They probably felt pressure to make sure every major idea was clear, but clarity isn't the same as emotional impact. You can explain a theme perfectly and still not make the audience feel it. That's where the show needs more confidence. Let Aang be quiet sometimes. Let Katara show frustration without turning it into a speech. Let Sokka hide insecurity behind actual humor instead of just functional dialogue. Let Zuko's anger sit in the room without immediately unpacking it. Let Ira's wisdom come through behavior, not just advice. Trust the scene, trust the actors, trust the audience, because the bones of the story are strong enough. We understand that Aang is carrying guilt. We understand that the Fire Nation is dangerous. We understand that Zuko wants honor. We understand that Katara wants to become stronger. We understand that Sokka is trying to protect people without having bending powers. The show doesn't need to underline every point, it needs to let those points breathe, and that's why the dialogue is such a big issue. It doesn't destroy the season, but it keeps reminding you that this adaptation is working too hard to explain a story that should feel more natural. It turns emotional beats into information. It turns character conflict into statements. It turns mystery into instruction. For a world as magical as Avatar, that's a shame, because sometimes the most powerful thing a character can say is nothing at all. One of the things I missed most in Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, wasn't a specific scene, it was the fun. And I know that sounds simple, maybe even a little unfair, because this version is clearly trying to take the story seriously. The Fire Nation is dangerous. Aang is carrying real grief. The world is at war. People are scared. There's trauma everywhere. So yes, a heavier tone makes sense in some places, but Avatar was never powerful because it was serious all the time. That was the magic of the original. It could be about genocide, war, destiny, grief, and spiritual balance, but it still remembered that the main characters were kids. They were awkward, they were silly, they made bad jokes, they got jealous, they argued over stupid things. They had fun even when the world around them was broken. The live-action version often forgets that. It feels like the show is so focused on making the story mature and important that it loses some of the warmth that made the original so easy to love. The humor isn't completely gone, but it's definitely reduced. Sokka gets some comedic lines, sure, but a lot of them feel safer, softer, less sharp. Aang has moments of innocence, but not enough of that playful spark. Katara is written with so much seriousness that her softer, warmer side doesn't always come through naturally, and without that playfulness, the journey starts to feel heavier than it should. That matters, because humor in Avatar wasn't just decoration. It wasn't there only to give the audience a break before the next dramatic moment. It was part of the character writing. Sokka's sarcasm told us who he was. Aang's goofy energy made his sadness hit harder. Katara's emotional reaction showed both her strength and her youth. Even Ira's lightness, his tea obsession, his strange little jokes, his relaxed warmth made his wisdom feel human instead of preachy. When you remove too much of that, you don't just make the show more serious, you make it flatter. The characters begin to feel like they're constantly carrying the weight of the plot instead of living inside the world. They move from one tense conversation to another, talking about responsibility, destiny, pain, and fear. And again, those themes belong here. But when they dominate too much, the show loses contrast. The emotional scenes need lighter moments around them, otherwise everything starts playing at the same level, and it becomes exhausting in a quiet way. The original knew how to let the audience relax with these characters. It let us enjoy their company, That's why the darker moments worked. We cared because we'd seen them laugh, we'd seen them be annoying, we'd seen them act like actual kids, not just symbolic figures in a fantasy war. This adaptation sometimes treats fun like it's less important than drama, but fun was part of the drama. That's why Sokka being rude, sarcastic, and immature mattered. That's why Aang wanting to avoid responsibility sometimes mattered. That's why the group just messing around mattered. These weren't random distractions. They were the pieces that made the characters feel alive before the story asked them to grow. And I think that's where this version could improve the most in future seasons. It doesn't need to become a comedy. It doesn't need to copy every joke from the animated series. But it does need to loosen up. Let the characters breathe. Let them tease each other. Let Sokka be a little more ridiculous. Let Aang be a child, not just the Avatar. Let Katara have moments that aren't only built around concern or seriousness. Because right now, the show sometimes feels afraid that too much humor will make the world less important. But with Avatar, the opposite is true. The humor makes the world more important, because it reminds us what these characters are fighting to protect. Not just nations, not just balance, not just destiny. A life, the messy, warm, funny, imperfect life that exists between all the big dramatic speeches and battles. That's the feeling this adaptation needs more of. Not just visual magic, not just bending, not just respect for the plot. A warmth, because without that, Avatar still looks like Avatar, but it doesn't always feel like it. The thing about Avatar, The Last Airbender, is that the adventure was never just about getting from one location to another. It was about the people traveling together. And that's one area where the Netflix version feels like it skips a few emotional steps. Aang, Katara, and Sokka are supposed to become this messy little found family. Not instantly, not perfectly, but slowly. They're supposed to irritate each other, protect each other, misunderstand each other, laugh at the wrong times, argue over dumb things, and then somehow keep choosing to stay together anyway. That's what makes the journey feel alive. In the live-action version, you understand that they're a team because the story tells you they are. They travel together, they face danger together, they share important conversations, but the bond itself doesn't always feel like it has enough space to grow naturally. It's there, but it feels thinner than it should. And I think a big reason is the lack of downtime. The original animated series had room for moments that didn't seem huge on the surface. Small jokes, random detours, weird side adventures, Sokka being dramatic over something silly, Aang getting distracted because he's still a kid, Katara getting frustrated because she's trying to hold everyone together. Those scenes weren't filler in the lazy sense. They were the glue. This version cuts a lot of that glue. So what happens is the characters keep moving through plot, but they don't always feel like they're living with each other. They feel assigned to the same quest more than emotionally bonded by it. And that matters, because when the show later asks us to care about their friendship, it hasn't always done enough of the everyday work that makes that friendship believable. You need the quiet scenes. You need the silly scenes. You need the scenes where nobody is explaining destiny or trauma or war, and the characters are just being young, awkward, tired, annoyed, or excited. That's how you make the audience feel like they know them, not just as heroes, but as people. The live-action version sometimes seems afraid of those pauses. It wants to keep pushing forward, maybe because it only has 8 episodes, maybe because it's trying to hold the attention of a streaming audience, maybe because it thinks serious fantasy needs to constantly remind us of the stakes. But the stakes hit harder when you care about the group. And caring about the group comes from time spent with them. Aang especially needs that kind of space. He's not just the Avatar. He's a boy who lost everything, but he's also still someone who wants to laugh, play, avoid pressure, and enjoy being alive. If the show only focuses on his burden, he starts feeling more like a symbol than a kid, and that weakens the tragedy, because Aang's sadness works best when it sits right beside his childish joy. Katara also needed more room. She can't just be the emotional center by default. We need to see her warmth, her anger, her stubbornness, her humor, her impatience, her growth. The show gives her serious material, but it doesn't always give her enough texture between those serious beats. And Sokka, honestly, might be hurt the most by this approach, because his personality depends so much on rhythm, his sarcasm, his insecurity, his overconfidence, his protectiveness, his bad jokes. All of that needs interaction. He needs people to bounce off. He needs awkward group moments. He needs time to be wrong, annoying, funny, and then slowly better. When the show softens him and also removes a lot of casual group banter, his arc loses some of its shape. That's the bigger issue here. The friendship doesn't feel completely absent, but it feels undercooked. There are moments where you can see the version this could become. A look here, a small exchange there, a bit of shared danger that starts to bring them closer. But then the story moves on too quickly. Instead of letting the chemistry build, it jumps back into the next important event. And for a show like Avatar, that's a costly trade, because this story isn't just about defeating the Fire Nation. It's about a group of kids becoming strong enough to face a broken world together. If we don't feel the friendship, the journey becomes more mechanical. The plot still works, the visuals still entertain, but the emotional engine is weaker. That's why I keep coming back to the same thought. The show needed more ordinary moments, not boring moments, ordinary ones. Moments where Aang, Katara, and Sokka feel like they exist outside the plot. Moments where they laugh when they shouldn't. Moments where they're scared but try to hide it. Moments where they start to understand each other without saying some big, meaningful line. That's where real chemistry is built. And if future seasons want to capture more of what made Avatar special, this is one of the first things they need to fix. Slow down just enough. Let the group breathe. Let them be kids on a journey, not just characters carrying mythology from one episode to the next. Because the world may be built on 4 elements, but the story is built on friendship. The acting in Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, is one of those things I kept going back and forth on while watching, because I don't think the cast is lazy. That's not the problem. You can tell most of the actors are really trying to honor these characters. There's effort here. There's sincerity. Nobody feels like they walked onto set with zero respect for the material. And honestly, with a story this beloved, that matters, and you want to feel like the people playing Aang, Katara, Sokka, Zuko, Aira, and everyone else understand that fans aren't just watching costumes and bending effects, they're watching characters they already have an emotional attachment to. But effort doesn't always equal a strong performance, and that's where the show becomes uneven. Some scenes work, some performances settle in better as the season goes on. There are moments where you can see the actors finding the rhythm of the world, especially when the writing gives them something more grounded to play. But then there are other scenes where the line delivery feels stiff, or too careful, or just slightly unnatural. Not always terrible, but noticeable enough that it pulls you out of the moment. And in a fantasy show, that can be dangerous, because the audience is already being asked to believe in bending, spirit worlds, flying bison, ancient wars, and nations built around elements. If the acting feels too wooden, the whole illusion gets weaker. Suddenly, instead of being inside the world, you're watching actors stand in costumes explaining the plot. That happened a few times for me. The younger cast especially has a tough job, and I do want to be fair about that. These aren't easy roles. Aang isn't just a cheerful kid. He's carrying guilt, grief, innocence, fear, and destiny all at the same time. Katara has to be warm, strong, wounded, hopeful, and stubborn without becoming flat. Sokka has to be funny without turning into a cartoon, but also flawed enough that his growth means something. That's a lot to ask from young performers. And sometimes the show asks even more by giving them dialogue that doesn't sound natural in the first place. When a script is full of exposition and serious speeches, even experienced actors can struggle to make it feel casual. So when the performances feel stiff, I don't think the blame sits only with the cast. The writing is part of it, the direction is part of it, the pressure of recreating iconic animated personalities is definitely part of it. Still, the unevenness is there. There are scenes where emotion should land harder, but the delivery feels too flat. There are moments that should feel playful, but the timing isn't sharp enough. Some interactions feel rehearsed rather than lived in. And because the original animated series was so expressive, the comparison becomes even more brutal. Animation allowed those characters to have huge faces, fast reactions, exaggerated comedy, and sudden emotional shifts. In live action, that same energy has to come from the actors, and not everyone fully gets there. The Fire Nation side often comes out stronger. Zuko, Azula, and sometimes IRL feel like they have more dramatic weight to work with, as their scenes are built around shame, ambition, pressure, power, and family wounds, and that material gives the actors something solid to grab onto. Dallas Liu's Zuko in particular tends to feel more focused than a lot of the hero side material, and Daniel Dae Kim brings presence to Ozai. Even when the show itself gets uneven, that side of the story usually feels more controlled. The main trio is trickier. Their chemistry should be the heart of the show, but because the performances are inconsistent and the writing keeps rushing them forward, they don't always click the way they need to. You get glimpses of it as small moments where you think, okay, this could grow into something, but then another stiff exchange comes in, or a joke doesn't land, or a serious line sounds too formal, and the group dynamic loses a little spark. That's probably the best way to describe the acting overall. It has sparks. It just doesn't have a steady flame yet. There are also supporting performances that stand out in different ways. Some characters feel closer to the spirit of the original than others. Some actors seem more comfortable inside the heightened tone, others look like they're still figuring out how big or small to play this world. And that inconsistency makes the show feel like it's still searching for its performance style. Is it supposed to be grounded and serious, a little theatrical, playful and heightened, epic fantasy, or coming-of-age adventure? The best version of Avatar is all of those things at once, but live action has to balance that very carefully, and this first season doesn't always manage it. That said, I don't think the acting is beyond repair. Actually, this is one area where future seasons could improve a lot. Young actors grow, chemistry can develop, writers can learn what each performer does best, directors can loosen the scenes up and let the characters feel less locked into speeches. So while the performances are definitely one of the show's weaker points, I wouldn't call them hopeless. They're sincere, they're uneven, and sometimes, honestly, they're frustrating, because you can see what they're reaching for. The cast wants this to work, that part is clear, but wanting it to work and making every scene feel alive are two different things. And for a story as emotional, funny, and character-driven as Avatar, the acting can't just be decent, it has to carry the soul. Right now, it carries pieces of it, but not the whole thing. For a show like Avatar, The Last Airbender, the main trio is everything. You can have the bending, the Fire Nation, the world building, the costumes, the big music, the dramatic speeches, all of it, but if Aang, Katara, and Sokka don't feel right together, the whole thing starts to wobble, and that's one of the biggest problems with this live-action version. The three of them are there, they're traveling together, facing danger together. The story clearly wants us to believe they're becoming this little family on the road, but the chemistry doesn't always feel natural yet. It feels more like the show is placing them in the same scenes and expecting the bond to appear because we already know it should be there. That's not enough. The original animated series made the group dynamic feel effortless. Aang brought the innocence and wonder, Katara brought the emotional drive and compassion, Sokka brought the sarcasm, the insecurity, the jokes, the protective older brother energy. They balanced each other. Even when they argued, there was life in it, and you felt the rhythm between them. Here, that rhythm is still shaky. Sometimes Aang feels isolated inside his own burden. Katara feels locked into being serious and supportive. Sokka gets a few comedic lines, but not always enough real bite or awkward personality to bounce off the others. So instead of the group feeling messy and alive, they can feel a little too controlled, a little too written, and this is where the rushed season structure really hurts them. Chemistry needs ordinary moments. You need to see the characters being tired together, annoyed together, bored together, amused by each other. You need the small stuff, the jokes that don't matter, the arguments that aren't about destiny, the little looks that say, yeah, these kids are slowly learning how to trust each other. The show doesn't give them enough of that. It gives them danger, it gives them speeches, it gives them shared goals. But shared goals aren't the same as emotional connection. Just because characters are moving in the same direction doesn't automatically mean they feel close. And with Aang, Katara, and Sokka, that closeness is supposed to be the heartbeat of the story. There are glimpses where it almost works, a few small exchanges, a few moments where the performers seem to relax. And you can imagine the group dynamic becoming stronger in later seasons. It's not completely dead. That's important to say. It's not like these three have no potential together, but in season 1 the bond feels underdeveloped. It's especially noticeable because the Fire Nation material often has clearer tension. Zuko and Aira, for example, have a relationship that feels more defined. Even when it's not perfect, you understand the emotional push and pull. With the main trio, the show sometimes assumes we already care about them as a unit because the original taught us to care, but this version still has to earn that on its own. That's the tricky thing about adaptation. You can borrow the characters' names, their costumes, their destinations, and their major story beats, but you can't borrow chemistry. Chemistry has to happen in the scenes and has to build through timing, reactions, silence, mistakes, and personality clashes. Right now, the live-action trio feels like they're still waiting for that spark, and I don't think it's only the actors. The writing plays a huge part. When the dialogue is too formal, or the scenes are too focused on moving the plot, the performers don't get enough room to simply exist together. They're always explaining, reacting, preparing, worrying, or running toward the next major event. That makes the friendship feel functional instead of lived in.